Hello and welcome. You're watching Obi and Horn of Africa. This is Future Africa Spotlight. Today, we're going to talk about the suspension of Ethiopia from AGOA Privilege and the state of Ethiopian current economy. I joined by economics scholar from Washington, D.C. live, Mr. Zemedeneh Nigatu. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Okay. What is your take on the suspension of Ethiopia from AGOA privilege? Do you think that is the right decision made by President Biden?
So, as you indicated, President Biden has signed an executive order informing Congress that he will be suspending Ethiopia's AGOA's privileges effective 4 days from now on New Year's Day, January 1st. And I have to say, I've been on the record repeatedly for the last several months that I think it's a misguided decision. I think it's the wrong decision. I don't believe it addresses or it in any way, shape, or form reflects the long relationship Ethiopia and the United States have had over 100 years. And also, I think it's unfair because it targets mostly women, because a lot of the AGOA exports from Ethiopia, the data, the information that we have indicates is, for example, from those industrial parks where there's a lot of investment, garments exported to the United States. A lot of those people who work in these places are young women. So my argument, and many others have been trying to make to the administration here in Washington, both in the administration as well as in Congress, is by revoking Ethiopia's AGOA's privileges, it unfairly targets women, most of them mothers, and we are saying, what's the logic behind such a decision? Because, as I said, the United States and Ethiopia have had a long-term relationship over more than 100 years, and we don't think this is the right way to go about it. So, in summary, unfair. In summary, it does not reflect the relationship. And also, when you look at it, it's designed, I think, in my view, to discourage investors from investing in Ethiopia. Because when you say you no longer have privileges, duty-free privileges in AGOA, under AGOA to export your stuff to the United States, you're telling investors in a backhanded way, maybe this is not a place you should invest. And we don't think that's fair either. So I disagree. And a lot of us here in the United States, a lot of the diaspora, a lot of other people are actually, even a lot of senators and congressmen agree with our position. We've been lobbying for the last several months. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, my position and the position of many others regarding the decision.
Okay. The suspension of Ethiopia from AGOA is enacted because Ethiopia is undertaking a conflict in the northern part of the country. Would that resolve the ongoing conflict?
Think about it, what it's going to do, right? There is the data that we've been able to get from the American Chamber of Commerce in Addis a few months ago when we were all participating in the press conference. They released the data that shows 200,000 Ethiopians at the moment directly benefit from jobs linked to AGOA. That's 200,000 direct. Then there's another 1 million indirect jobs, okay, from logistics companies, other service providers. So altogether, there are 1.2 million Ethiopians employed, directly or indirectly, from jobs linked to AGOA. So to answer your question, by the United States, by revoking AGOA's privileges, essentially is putting 1.2 million Ethiopians on the unemployment line. And what we're saying is, how does that achieve an objective of whatever it is the United States is trying to achieve? Whatever, as you mentioned, if it's designed to address concerns and issues that the U.S. has in the conflict in another part of Ethiopia, I said, how does this achieve that objective by unemploying 1.2 million Ethiopians? And let me just circle back to something. The United States gives about $1 billion a year in aid to Ethiopia. At least that's the official data. Fine. You're giving $1 billion for what? To help Ethiopians bootstrap themselves, uplift themselves, get jobs, train, and just change their lives. So it's aid. This is, by the way, I mean, fine generosity of Americans. That's good. But on the other hand, these people are not asking, these 1.2 million Ethiopians, they're not asking for aid. They already have jobs, okay? So what would be, where's the logic between giving aid for people to reach a level of employment, to reach humanitarian assistance and other things, but at the same time, you are forcing a million to Ethiopians on the unemployment. So there's a disconnect. So in other words, I don't see how this achieves America's objectives in Ethiopia.
Let's talk about the state of Ethiopian economy. And how do you see Ethiopian economy over the last 20 or 13 years by comparing with the current Ethiopian economic stat?
Right. So if you look at the official data from the likes of the IMF, the World Bank, and the Ethiopian government's data, and many others, I think the last, I would say 15 years or so, the Ethiopian economy has done well. It was amongst the fastest growing in the world because Ethiopia was investing in infrastructure and the things that will propel the economy even to the next level. And then the last 3 years, let's call it economic reform years with the government, and you see the official presentation by the Ministry of Finance and others in the Ethiopian government, they said that, okay, the growth is being acknowledged, what Ethiopia achieved the previous, say, 10 or 12 years being what it is. To sustain it, reforms were needed. For example, the debt level was unsustainable, so Ethiopia has entered into a debt reprofiling negotiation phase with the IMF. And also, the government has curtailed on new borrowings. For example, commercial borrowings have been suspended, but at the same time focusing on completing projects that are underway so that these projects can start delivering results. In other words, a reform was needed, going back, acknowledging the growth, but to sustain. So because of that, there's a new 10-year perspective plan up to 2030 that is designed to make Ethiopia a middle-income country and the economy to grow sustainable. So looking back, that's what the facts show. But I'm fairly confident over the next X number of years, Ethiopia can sustain very high levels of growth. And let me explain why that is. I've said this in many other medium. As you probably know, I speak a lot of media to a lot of international media, and I've said, and they ask me, how can Ethiopia grow? What are the outlooks? And the short answer is the long-term fundamentals of the Ethiopian economy are still very strong. It was strong a year or two ago, will continue to be over the next 5 to 10 years. What we see in Ethiopia today, in my view, and I've stated this on my Twitter page, I've stated this in other places, what Ethiopia is facing today is a very short-term challenge, which I am fairly confident that it will overcome it very soon. I mean, that's just a statement of fact. It will overcome it. So you need to look beyond the here and now and say, okay, a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, where do you think the economy will be? In my view, it will regain its momentum. It will regain the growth trajectory it was on with the reforms continuing. And that's important. I mean, the reforms have to continue. And the high growth rate that Ethiopia achieved in the past is doable. When we talk about fundamentals, for example, it's a very large country. So the migration to industrialization, leveraging the large labor pool, very young, talented, educatable pool of talent, which is kind of rare in Africa. That by itself, I mean, if you look at China, over the last 30, 40 years, China used that very large population to grow into the second largest economy in Ethiopia. On a smaller scale, but China-like growth in Ethiopia is achievable by leveraging, already there's like 45 million young Ethiopians who are ready to be deployed. So that's one of the fundamentals that drive the growth. The migration to industrialization, we've seen that large investments have been made and will continue to be made into industrial parks in a very focused way. Agro-industrial parks, garments, pharmaceuticals, technology parks. These are very focused. We see very, very rare, very few African countries have this kind of coordinated strategy. Yes, it needed focus. It's been given more focus, but I think that will help Ethiopia propel. The other thing I'm very excited about is a bit of a medium to long term is the opening up of Africa through the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So using Ethiopia as a base, we can export from Ethiopia to across Africa because the home base is relatively large. As you know, the Ethiopian economy, an aggregate GDP of Ethiopia today in sub-Saharan Africa is the third largest, the third, fourth, depending on who's counting. Sometimes it's Kenya, but it's a sizable economy. So if you use that, leveraging that, you can use the ACFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade, to export to the rest of Africa, duty-free, quota-free. So there's a lot of things that are actually in favor of Ethiopia, as I said, once you look beyond the here and now. And that's why I'm excited. FDI, if you look at FDI, even this year, I mean, I have to be honest, in a pleasant way, the other day, for example, the investment commissioner announced that the first 4 months of this year, fiscal year, the country has received about $1 billion in FDI, despite the challenges that are being, headlined. So imagine when normalcy regains and investors start coming back to Ethiopia in the numbers that they did in the past. All these combined, in my view, will help sustain a very fast growth of the economy in the future. Are there challenges? Yes, but the reform will take care of that, and the short-term challenges that Ethiopia is currently facing will be overcome. While some might say, well, how can we imagine that? Well, what's going on in Ethiopia today? I say it will be overcome. It will come to an end. The conflict will come to an end. And I think investors will regain their confidence, and the Ethiopian economy, as I said, the fundamentals will still be attractive 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. And I'm very optimistic about the future.
Yeah, it's part of the government's plan. In 2030, Ethiopia is going to be the beacon of African prosperity. Do you agree? And how do you see this ambitious plan as well?
Right. As I just said, the reforms have to continue. I think that's essential. And the focus of industrialization. And one thing I should have mentioned earlier. Remember, the Ethiopian economy today is primarily agriculture. I think something like 55% of the GDP is agriculture. The modernization of Ethiopia's agriculture, for example, will propel the economy to a very rapid growth. And I know sometimes there's a tendency to overlook that portion when we talk about manufacturing and all that. When we talk about industrialization, by the way, it includes very significant transformation of agriculture into value addition, whether it's exporting processed coffee, packaged coffee from Ethiopia, to sesame, to even new products like avocados, okay? So we need to focus on the importance of agriculture. And also, we see a lot of good results these days, mechanization of farming, which hasn't been done in the past in large scale. So agriculture will continue to propel the growth of the economy. But what you see, though, is the proportion of agriculture's contribution to the GDP, it will be lessened, even though it's rapid, because the others will start taking over. I'll give you an example. Here in the United States, one of the most advanced economy in the world, the world's largest economy, agriculture still accounts for a very significant portion of the American economy. So with the focus that Ethiopia has given to agriculture, I think is the right one. It's just the reality anyways. But also I think the opportunity in that area is enormous. When you look at our neighbors in the Middle East, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the UAE, and others in the Gulf, who import food all the way from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, can actually import it from Ethiopia. So the focus given to agriculture will prepare the economy, the migration to industrialization. By the way, the industrialization includes, as you know, agro-processing plants as well, okay? So the clothing manufacturing, like labor-intensive industries that are now looking for the next China, I'm very confident will choose Ethiopia, will continue to choose Ethiopia as a destination of choice.
Okay, Mr. Zemedeneh, let me get back to the AGOA-related question. Of course, it's a very disingenuous decision that made by President Biden. Still, the government is working to compensate the loss that the country is going to incur due to this AGOA privilege. China is planning to usher the same duty-free opportunity for African nations. Do you think that would exactly compensate the loss that the nation incur due to the suspension from AGOA?
Right. First and foremost, I'm going to be sharing with you my personal views. I think if eventually, sometime in 2022, if not certainly in 2023, I am confident Ethiopia's AGOA privileges will be reinstated. Okay. I was actually, I know it's getting ahead of ourselves here. I was just happy to hear the State's Department spokesperson, was it yesterday? Yeah. Or today actually said, well, they're on track to revoke it as of the Saturday, but he said if something changes, we'll advise. I think it was just being, I don't know, playful or something. But I think it will be reinstated. Now, that just put that aside for a second. As you said, there's actually a very huge global market for what Ethiopia produces and sells. Okay, you mentioned China. That's China. In fact, listen, part of what's going on in Ethiopia is geopolitics, right? The huge global rivalry by the two superpowers. I mean, it's very evident in what's going on there. I remember tweeting this thing a couple weeks ago when I saw the contrast between how China is approaching Ethiopia and how the United States is approaching Ethiopia. And if you remember, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, visited Kenya about a month ago to do what? To talk about Ethiopia. So he actually flew all the way to Kenya to talk about Ethiopia. A couple of weeks later, the Chinese foreign minister flew to Ethiopia to talk about Ethiopia. And I just saw the picture alone was telling a story that the Chinese wanted to engage directly, and the United States decided to engage Ethiopia via Kenya. I mean, anyways, so we could not discount the involvement of the two superpowers and what's going on in Ethiopia. And this was also a reflection of the importance of Ethiopia from a global perspective. So it's just an interesting dichotomy. I mean, the optics was just amazing. Here's one foreign minister, and I did one foreign minister in Nairobi, but the main discussion is Ethiopia. And I think that shows you a bit of maybe a misunderstanding by the Americans about Ethiopia, how to engage Ethiopia. I mean, I think the US could have done a better job of engaging in Ethiopia. Anyways, there's a global market for Ethiopia to export its products, whether it's to China, and then, as I said, to be honest with you, if an exporter can successfully produce and sell to the US market 10,000 miles away, I think it's fair to assume it can be done in Nairobi or sell it in Lagos or Dar es Salaam. So the African market. The thing is, though, these are medium to long-term objectives. The immediacy, what I think the reason we're all focusing on AGOA is how sudden it was, the decision. By the way, AGOA is expected to expire in 2025, in 3 years for everybody. Now, unless Congress renews it, they might renew it. So had Ethiopia been given a bit more running room, so in 2-3 years, actually, we may not have been as concerned as we are now. So the suddenness, like the US is pulling the rug under you without informing you, without giving you a time to prepare. I think that's the only reason. Now, I have to be honest, we are in the manufacturing business, we're producing in Ethiopia for the global market. The US market is very big. At the moment, it's the world's largest. So losing that, I think, has some short-term costs. In the long term, some of it could be offset by exporting more to Europe, by exporting more to, China, as you said, has announced something like 98% of Africa's products can enter China, similar to AGOA, the Chinese market. Well, that's good. China is, in the next 5 years, going to become the world's largest economy. Already, the Chinese consumers are amongst the largest spenders. So there is an opportunity for China. In a very interesting kind of way, you can see Chinese manufacturers setting up manufacturing facilities in Ethiopia to export back perhaps to China. I mean, it may seem a bit, out of the thinking box when we discuss this today, But it's quite possible because China is outsourcing and moving certain production facilities out of China because Chinese labor is expensive. China has become very affluent, so they may not want to do. Yes, a lot of it is going to their neighbors, setting up factories in Vietnam and Bangladesh, but quite a lot of it can also come to Ethiopia and has been coming to Ethiopia, and that some of it could be re-exported back. So this is the outlook I have, and I'm optimistic. As one, AGOA will be reinstated, and two, there's a big global market. But Ethiopia, by the way, needs to address a couple of things. One is efficiency, which I know is doable. These manufacturing plants have to be at the level of global competitors like Vietnam, Bangladesh. I'm talking about the garment industry, but in everything else, so that we can sell our products whether we have duty-free privileges or not.
Okay, all right. Obviously, sanction is a dime a dozen when it comes to American politics, and they use it as an instrument to humiliate pragmatic leaders in continent Africa and in the Middle East as well. But in what way should take it as a blessing in disguise? Because there are certain nations who used sanction as a blessing. For instance, we can name Iran, Turkey, and other nations used sanction to claim their prosperity and economic independence as well.
Right. So if you look back at U.S. policies, foreign policies over the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, sanctions has been one of the tools that the U.S., especially financial sanctions, is one of the tools the U.S. uses from time to time. And I think you mentioned Iran and other places. This is, I mean, every country has certain views of how it wants to engage globally. What is happening, though, is in particular to Ethiopia. I'm on the record. I think sanctions are counterproductive. Financial sanctions, as I mentioned earlier, AGOA revoking Ethiopia's AGOA privilege is essentially a form of sanction. Okay, so I don't think this should not be the way the U.S. engages with Ethiopia. I mean, sanction, we can talk about it in broad terms. I don't think there's enough time for that here, but specifically when it comes to Ethiopia, I think the U.S. should have and could have engaged Ethiopia in other ways to address, whatever bilateral concerns that they might be. I don't think sanctions are the way to go, all right? Especially when you unemploy permanently 1.2 million Ethiopians. It's unfair, and it also exasperates the situation in the country. It doesn't resolve whatever issues the U.S. has, okay? So in this case, I'll be on the record. I've been on the record since last year, by the way, when President Trump decided on the whip that because of the GERD issue, he cut off aid to Ethiopia. All right. So I'm on the record. If you go back to my Twitter page, if you go back to a lot of the interviews I've done and many other global media, I oppose the U.S. using sanctions on Ethiopia. It's counterproductive. It doesn't achieve its objectives. So they need to find. I think part of the reason, the challenge is the U.S.'s economic engagement with Africa, meaning its investments, and including Ethiopia, are not as big or not as significant as it should be considering the size of its economy. And let me give you data. There's data that shows that if you look at FDI figures for Africa for the last 5 years, if you go back 5-6 years ago, the US was the largest FDI investor in Africa. Today's China. So when you have less and less leverage because you don't economically engage with Africa, you don't economically engage with Ethiopia, okay? I mean, there's very little US investment in Ethiopia. So you can't say, well, I'm going to pull out my investments from Ethiopia because you have very little. Then you default to sanctions. Contrast that with China. China has by all accounts, something like $14 billion of investments or financing in Ethiopia. So China has actually a broader engagement with Ethiopia and a broader engagement with many African countries. So it has actually more influence economically speaking. So China doesn't have to default to sanctions. China doesn't have that kind of policy anymore. But the US, one of the standard tools in the toolboxes of US foreign policy is sanctions. I mean, it's been done in other countries. Now, it's the US's prerogative, but I just think specifically speaking, when it comes to Ethiopia, I think it's counterproductive. And I think the US should find other means of engaging Ethiopia.
Many political commentators claim that the recent economic-related sanctions being planned by the US and its allied group have the objective of stopping Ethiopia from realizing its regional integration plan. How do you see that?
I'll revert back to the comment I just made, where I think we can make a statement, a very strong statement, that sanctions, economic sanctions, are counterproductive and will not in any shape or form help the United States achieve whatever objective it's trying to achieve in Ethiopia. So I think it needs to be rethought. As I said, I've been public about this here in Washington and other places. The US should have a better tool for engaging in Ethiopia. So I think the sanctions should certainly not be the way, especially, you know, I'm in the finance world, I'm the economic side of things. I think economic sanctions simply are totally counterproductive. It takes years, if not decades, to build economies, but sanctions can destroy them in a very short period of time. And I think that should be factored in by the US policymakers in the case of Ethiopia, and not use sanctions, economic sanctions, as tools.
Okay, the TPLF initiated war has brought so many problems and disasters in a country's economy. How do you see that again?
So listen, for prosperity, sustained economic growth, I've been in the business, the investment field for more than 25 years around the world. I'll share with you what we do in the international investment community. For investors, there's a long checklist of things that investors look at when making decisions, right? Investment decisions. It could be policies, macroeconomic stability, but one of the things investors, whether it's in Ethiopia or in Latin America, where I spent many years, or anywhere else in the world, especially in emerging markets, is political stability, safety, security. So this is why I was saying earlier, the challenge that Ethiopia is facing in those fronts are short-term, okay? Foreign investors looking at to invest in Ethiopia right now is saying, okay, we still think the long-term fundamentals are attractive. We still think we'll invest in Ethiopia, but they will be looking at this thing coming to an end, right? Which it will come to an end pretty soon. So once you establish that, I think the momentum, the economic growth momentum will be regained. Like we've seen in other countries, that's something called post-conflict investments, post-conflict reconstruction. That also helps propel growth. So my view is the situation right now will come to an end, and then the rebuilding of certain parts of the country that have been affected by the conflict, I think will require, billions of dollars. That by itself, whether it's from domestic resources, but also I think Ethiopia's international partners financing some of it will be part of the regaining of the momentum process. So I'll go back to what I said at the beginning. I'm very confident about the long-term outlook of the Ethiopian economy. The fundamentals are strong, but we just have to look beyond the here and now. Imagine what it will be like 6 months, a year from now, 2 years, and I think the growth prospects will continue to be attractive.
What has to be the long-term economic growth and economic recovery after the war ends?
Right. So, not to completely repeat what I said earlier, the economic reforms that were started 2.5 years ago will have to continue. That's very important. Giving the priority, making the private sector the engine block of the Ethiopian economy, which is part of the reform process, that has to continue. And I'm fairly confident. By the way, even today, despite a year of challenge that Ethiopia has faced, the economy actually have been, by certain measures, resilient, right? Let me give you a marker. I track the banking sector's performance in Ethiopia. And we've seen all the banks, because whatever the banks do is a reflection of the performance of the broader economy. Almost every bank which has reported its performance for this year has reported record profits, record deposit mobilizations, and many of them are actually announcing capital increases and making new investments. So, I think, we look at, as financial people, as investors, we look at real tangible markets. This is not to discount the effect the conflict has had on the economy. There has. I think the government has been very open about it. Actually, the finance ministry making public statements, and it has been, of course. I think the PM, the Prime Minister said that about 2 billion, I think it was 2.5 billion already was spent on the conflict. So there is obviously a financial cost to what took place. But on the other side, I think there's a certain level of resiliency by the economy, resiliency by the Ethiopian people. And once this conflict ends, once the challenge that Ethiopia faced ends very soon, you can see the reform taking off significantly, because you have now a clearer path to where you want to go. And I think that's what gives us hope and I think optimism for the economy of the next several years. By the way, that 10-year perspective plan that the government has put together by 2030, I think it is more than achievable. Because for a country of 117 million people going to 180 million in the next 20 years, there'll be 180 million Ethiopians in 20 years. Imagine that. The growth that is being forecast is doable. It's just that the reforms have to continue. And that's sort of the view that I have, and many of my colleagues who look at emerging markets, including Ethiopia, are looking at. But I'll just re-emphasize, we need to look at beyond the here and now.
Ethiopians and friends of Ethiopians are coming to Ethiopia per the great homecoming challenge, right? What is the economic advantage of this challenge?
So listen, I'll answer that by using examples of other countries that have actually tapped into the enormous diaspora base that they have, the Indians and the Chinese, okay? Here in the United States, we have very large Indian community who've successfully integrated into the American economy, now contribute to the growth of India. The Chinese have done the same thing. Ethiopian diaspora, especially here in the United States, is very large. Okay, by some estimates, it could be about 1 million. That's one, economic power. Two, the knowledge that they have by residing in this country, by doing business in this country, by being educated in this country, could benefit tremendously Ethiopia's future. And that's why I was very happy when this announcement of coming back for the holidays. It might be coming back for the holidays, for many could also be going back home for good.
So are you planning to come to Ethiopia?
I was keeping that for the end of the discussion, but now that you asked me, I'm actually going to be in Ethiopia next week. So I'm actually bringing in my entire family to Ethiopia next week. Okay.
Welcome.
So I was going to make that at the back end of my discussion, but remember, I live half the time in Ethiopia anyways, right? As you know, we do business in Ethiopia, but my family, especially my newborn son, I have a 22-month-old boy who was born here. He hasn't seen Ethiopia yet. So we're taking him to Ethiopia next week. My wife is coming and my entire family. My son, actually, who's in college, is on on college break for Christmas in Ethiopia already. He left a few days ago. He's in Addis already. He and his friends, and this is the thing, he's 19. He and several of his friends here in the United States from college decided, once they heard that there's this big invitation to come visit Ethiopia, they decided instead of spending Christmas and New Year in Ethiopia, they planned their trips. And a lot of them from the US, young generation, 19, 20-year-olds are now in Addis Ababa. So, but on a more broader scale, I think engaging the diaspora benefits both the diaspora, but also Ethiopia. The knowledge, the know-how, and the financial capital that the diaspora brings to Ethiopia. And the other thing, and just to close this loop, is look how the diaspora was engaged this year and what's going on in Ethiopia. Unlike any time, I mean, I grew up in the United States. I came when I was very young as a teenager. There wasn't this kind of engagement, this level of engagement before. So if we can convert that on a sustainable basis, I think Ethiopia can benefit, like I said, like the Indians have done, the Chinese have done, many other immigrant community, diaspora communities have done. That would be a big, big, big plus for Ethiopia. But we're very excited about the holidays coming to Addis, to Ethiopia, and we look forward to it next week.
In Amhara and Afar regions, TPLF forces looted both private and public properties, and they also burned down resources into ashes. They have vandalized resources as well. They conducted rape. They have done all bad stuffs. And still the government is working to recover all the losses incurred out there. And what is your recommendation and advice in the ways how to revamp destruction happens there?
From the reporting that I've seen, I think there's a significant amount of investment is needed to rebuild areas that have been affected by the conflict. Okay, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that post-conflict investments are needed across the country, by the way. Okay, but also in certain parts of the country that you mentioned, there will be some specific reconstruction investment required, from basic services to manufacturing facilities, other things. So that will have to happen. And this is why I think Ethiopia's international development partners will have to engage with the Ethiopian government, because just domestic resources alone would not be sufficient for that. Okay? So my view is that once this thing is resolved, additional resources, some recurring, but some are one-off investments, will need to be made to rehabilitate the livelihoods of many people in those affected areas. I don't know what the exact amount is, but you might be able to get that from the Ministry of Finance, what the amount is needed. But definitely there's special investment needed for these areas.
I would like to wrap up my discussion with you here, but finally, if there is anything that you need to convey, please welcome.
Right. So since my area of expertise is investment, finance, capital, and then specifically about Ethiopia, it's worth repeating and reminding people that Ethiopia's economic outlook, long-term fundamentals were attractive before, will it be attractive in the future? I think that needs to be underlined, because sometimes as human beings, we tend to focus on what we see today, but we need to look at beyond that in a few months from now, a year from now, what the country will look like, what the opportunities are. So that's my main message. Fairly confident, fairly optimistic about Ethiopia regaining its economic momentum in a very short order.
Economic scholar, Mr. Zemedeneh Nigatu from Washington, D.C. Thank you for your precious time, and thank you for joining us this very critical time.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
A pleasure. Bye-bye. Dear viewers, this brings you to the end of our edition for today. See you next time with another edition. Bye-bye.